Hi students, in this video we're going to cover Razor views and ASP.NET Core MVC. Razor views are essentially just views in our web application. So by views, what do I mean by that? It's just an HTML web page. We're displaying an HTML web page. We're building it on the server side, and then we're telling the server to send that to the client. So the client being the user in Chrome or Edge or Firefox or whatever browser they're using to view your website is the view. So what do we mean by Razor views then? Well, Razor views is just the term coined by Microsoft to embed C# code inside of our HTML elements. That way we can customize our web pages to display the data that we have in HTML tables or create links with the data we have to gain more information into a particular item or product that we might have. So whenever we have those HTML elements, we're making data calls back to, let's say, our service or our database to get more information for the user. So by doing that, we're going to build C# elements using HTML views. And whenever we talk about that in ASP.NET Core MVC, we're talking about Razor to do that. And by Razor, that's just essentially C# markup. So in at the beginning of this video, I'm going to go ahead and just cover some of the high points in the PowerPoint before I move on to Visual Studio, where we start to implement some of this stuff in our code. So whenever we want to put the C# markup within our HTML, we'll always start with this @ symbol. So whenever we put our @ symbol in our markup or in our view, that's telling the Razor view that you're about to see some C# code. So that's why these are built on the server and then compiled, and then the HTML is then sent once it's built on the server to the web page. So after these are built on the server, everything kind of goes away and gets garbage collected. It gets turned into HTML. It gets sent to the client, and then after that, all your data is gone from the controller. The controller has finished its job. It's developed its markup. It gets sent to the client, and then it gets garbage collected, and it's not there anymore. So that's why a lot of times you need to develop some sort of caching or session strategies to keep your data from disappearing whenever you try to make another call. So we'll talk about session and storage and whatnot a little bit later on. But whenever you talk about cookies or the state of a website or session, we're talking about how that data gets stored. That way it can easily then get accessed again. You might have heard the term caching a lot when we talk about websites, because a lot of times the browser will actually cache a lot of that information, such as the CSS or JavaScript on your client. That way, whenever it reaches back out to the server to get more information, that's one less thing that it has to download. So it makes it a little bit more efficient when it goes out to get that information by caching a lot of that on your local machine. It makes you see the website faster. It makes it load faster. And that's why a lot of times when you're building ASP.NET websites, sometimes you'll have to clear the cache in order for your CSS or JavaScript or HTML to be seen properly, because it might be cached on the browser or on your personal machine when you go to view that information, when you try to view your updates after making a JavaScript change or after making a CSS change or whatever the case may be. Some of that stuff gets cached, so you may need to clear your cache to see the updates that you've made. So here's a way you can do an @ symbol, and then obviously you have these curly braces to tell your Razor view that you're about to see some C# code that you may need to decipher. And then you can also just do inline C# as well, here, just like this. Again, starting with the @ symbol, which we'll see here in a minute when I go to Visual Studio. So this just shows one way that we pass information to our view. So we have our iAction result of index. for the home controller, so it should look for, since we don't specify, it should look for the index view within the home folder. And then we're setting viewBag.customer equal to John, and then we're returning that view. So again, that returns the views home index HTML because we don't specify when we say return view. So we're essentially telling ASP.NET Core, or the framework, to go find the view that corresponds to this action in this controller. Here we see that our Razor markup is in our Razor view now. That's saying, hey, you're about to see some C# code, and you can see that once these curly braces start on the next line, now we're seeing some C# code. So string message equals welcome. And then if viewBag customer name is not equal to null, so if the viewBag customer name dictionary object is populated with something, then display welcome back, because maybe the customer name, they're already signed in, so we want to welcome that customer back to our website. And then you can see some inline as well here. So at message, we're displaying at message in a header tag. We're displaying the customer's name from the viewBag here. And then we're also, it just shows you some more inline C# here. So 2 plus 2 equals at 2 plus 2. So here's the C# and here's the HTML markup. So here's what that would look like then. It's displaying welcome back because that customer name was populated with John, and then it's showing 2 plus 2, and then it displays the C# version of 2 plus 2, which C# knows what to do with it. It compiles it, and it knows that equals 4. So this shows we can also code a for loop. So what we do is we're making, we want to code a dropdown with months. So what we can do is code that in a for loop. So here's our select. We're telling HTML that we want to have a combo box called month. That's a select element in HTML. And then we're using the @ sign that tells our Razor view that you're about to see some C#, and then after that you see that we have a for loop inside of our C# here. So when the month equals 1, we're going until the month is less than or equal to 12, and we're incrementing the month each time by 1. And then we're creating an option inside of our combo box, and the value is the month's @ month, which is this, and then the value is then that @ month as well. So the value here and the value here are the same, and it's essentially the month number that we want to put in this drop-down box. Okay. Here's another for each. So we're going to for each through some categories. These categories could come from a database or something somewhere. And that's kind of what I'm going to do in my Visual Studio demonstration as well. So I'm going to go ahead and skip over that. You can see we're using a ternary operator to set this CSS class onto our element. So you see here, if the viewBag selected category name is equal to all, then I want to set this element to active. Otherwise, I don't want to set it to active. So that's some other C# things that we're going to do on the server side to change our markup depending on if this category is active or not. So do we want to set this to active or not? So that's in a nutshell a lot of the things we're going to do in our C# Razor views. We'll also take a little bit of a deeper dive, and we'll cover again the layout, the view start, and the view imports. We'll take a look at again, and then we'll also look at using the helpers, the HTML helpers, or the tag helpers to jump between our controllers and our actions as well. So let's go ahead. So this PowerPoint is on Canvas for you to open and look at as well, if you'd like to go through the rest of it. We talk about the tag helpers, we talk about the view start, the view imports, and it talks about some formatting numbers in a view, binding properties from your model, which we'll do in this demonstration as well. I'm going to go ahead and close out of this. I have a website I've been making kind of just as a hobby. Um, it's one of my hobbies. I play video games just like anyone, so anyone our age. So one of the video games I played growing up was Diablo 2, where it was kind of a dungeon game where you it was a dungeon crawler and you uh, gathered items. So I actually have a database where I keep all of my items. So you see here that I have tables for item types and a table that has the basic items in Diablo 2. So you see here the item types in Diablo 2. There's swords, there's maces, there's staves, pole arms, axes, etc., etc. So I'm going to display these item types on a web page, and then I want to make anchors out of those for the user to click on, and then it will display those in my website to click on, and then to display then the items associated with, say, a sword. So if I clicked on sword, which you can see here is the ID of 1, I have a foreign key that comes out to these items that says the item type ID is 1. So the name it could be a short sword, it could be a scimitar, a saber, a two-handed sword, or whatever the case may be. And then the damage associated with those items, and just the data added or modified it in the table will get returned. So in my website, I have a few things. I actually use the repository patterns. There's a lot of projects here in mind that you might not have in your website. That's not really needed, but I have a project that essentially is a repository project that goes out to my data stores. You can see here that I have a proxy that goes out to a web service that I created locally. I don't have it deployed anywhere. So the first thing I do when I call get all items, it returns all of my Diablo 2 items. So I call get all items, that goes out to a proxy or to my web service to get all items from my web service. Otherwise, if my web service isn't running locally, so I don't have it running locally at the time, then I tell it to just go out to the database and get it. Because I'm lazy and I don't feel like starting up my web service locally. So just use Entity Framework Core to go out and get the items. So you can see here that I call my DB context to go get those items that I have dependency injected into my repository. I tell it to include the item type, so it should go out and match those item types based on the IDs. I then cast that to a list, and then I need to select it into a new Diablo 2 item type that I have returning from the repository. So they're different types because I have one that's a Diablo 2 item from my proxy, and then I have one that's a Diablo 2 item from my database. So that's the reason why you can tell that this namespace is my website. Doesn't do a great job of showing you Diablo 2 item. I was hoping it would show the namespaces, but I don't see the namespaces. Okay, anyways, it's not important. So we see if my proxy isn't running, that's when I catch an exception. It should time out trying to reach my proxy because it's not running locally. So that's why in this catch, I return my Entity Framework Core because I know my database exists locally and I don't really need to start my database up that exists all the time. So that's when I return back my Diablo 2 items from my Entity Framework Core instance. And I have all of that already injected in via dependency injection, coming here to my startup.cs file. You can see I have a couple scoped instances of my proxy and my repository, which are attached to interfaces. So anytime I use these interfaces, I tell my framework to go ahead and inject in those classes that reach out to those web services. And then I also add a DB context in that tells Entity Framework whenever you ask for a Diablo 2 context for a database to go ahead and get the connection string to use SQL Server from my configuration file or my app settings.json. So if you go to my app settings.json, you can see that I have inside of my connection strings a Diablo 2 context that points then, that has a connection string to my local database. So if I had this running in production, what I would have is these connection string elements. I would copy this and then paste it in here. Allowed host. Let me make sure I'm putting it in the right place. Let me just go ahead and copy this as well. So if I did have this running on a production server, I'd have a transform element for each one. So I'd have an app settings.development, an app settings.production, and then in that app settings.production, I would have a connection string to my database in production. But since it's just running locally, I'm just going to use this app settings.json local version that points to my local database. Okay, so what I want to do is reach out to that database and get those items to display on my web page. So I'm going to go ahead and start up my application here. Let me close out my app settings.json files. Okay, so here I have my welcome page. Learn about building web apps in ASP.NET Core. I could probably get rid of this. I believe that's in my index.cs HTML. Home index. Learn more with ASP.NET. I'll get rid of that. Okay. So now I have a link, show basic Diablo 2 items. So if we come here, you can see that I have this tag helper in my index.cs HTML. And in order to gain access to these tag helpers, remember we need to go to these view imports. And these view imports import all of our tag helpers. So you see add tag helper. And then we're adding the tag helpers using the Microsoft ASP.NET Core MVC tag helpers namespace. So that's how, if you're not seeing the tag helpers or they're not showing up via IntelliSense, make sure you have these tag helpers in your view imports.cs HTML. While we're talking about it, I also have the view start, which will give us a default layout. So I'm saying the default layout for my application is in the layout.cs HTML. So if we go to the shared folder, layout.cs HTML, which stands for C# HTML, which means a razor view essentially. We have all of a basic layout for our application, which this is just the basic layout or the template that comes with whenever you start up a new empty MVC project. So I didn't change anything here. You can see I have the body, the header. There's a footer object, and here is where the render body is inside of the container. So this is where all of our razor views will get injected in. Every time we tell our controller to return a view, will get injected into this render body here. Okay. And you can also see we have a render section for scripts. So if we ever want to put any sort of JavaScript inside of our razor views, we can do that, but we need to actually tell it to include it inside of the scripts section, which I'll also show here later on in the video. Okay, so now that we have this index HTML, we can see that whenever somebody clicks on show basic Diablo 2 items, what I want it to do is I want it to go to my items controller and the basic action. So I want it to show the basic items in my items controller. So then if we go to my items controller, if we come here, we see that I currently don't have a basic action. So I need to build that. So I need to build an action to show my Diablo 2 items. So I'm going to go ahead and say public I'm going to return an iAction result, which can be any sort of JSON result or view result or file result. I'm going to call it basic, since that's what I say the action is called. And then I'm going to go ahead and return view for now. So go and find a basic view inside of my items folder. So I already made an items, I have or basic CS.html here. And you can see that it's currently empty. So what I want to display are the item types from my database. So I'm actually going to make a view model to do that for me, because I'm going to need to bind that and send that whole model to my view. So to do that, I am going to come here, go to my models folder, and then inside of my models folder, I'm going to go ahead and make a new folder called view models. And then inside view models, I'm going to make a new file and call it items, item, categories, view model. Make sure I spelled everything correctly. Item categories view model.cs. Go ahead and create that. And what this will do is allow me to bind the things I want to send to my view in C#. So the difference between a model and a view model is view models can consist of one or more models to send to our view. So we could put models inside of our view model. Essentially everything we want to put on our view, we put in a view model. There's a pattern in ASP.NET called MVVM. Essentially that means model view view model. So whenever we want to bind models and send it to a view, we need to use a view model. So pretty much anything that should go to your view should be a view model instead of a model. So I have items category view model. I'm going to go ahead and put that in a namespace, a C# namespace, and I'm going to go ahead and call it, since my project is diablo2.com, I'm going to say com.diablo2.models.viewModels. I'm going to say public class item categories view model. Okay. And then inside of that, I want to go ahead and put our, let's see, what do I want to put in that? I want to put my item categories. So I'm going to go and put a list of, what are those called? Item type, list of item type. Item types. Let's go ahead, and it's going to give us some red lines because we need to import our list type. So we're going to import collections generic, and then we need to import our item types from our database. So I'm going to use my database entities, I'm pretty sure. If it's coming from my repository, what does my repository return? It returns back from entities, so I think I'm going to need the entities version. So using from entities, since I have multiple projects, I need to make sure I'm careful with which namespace I'm importing, because it might not import it from the right namespace, so then it'll break. So I think I'm getting it from the right namespace. So I have my item types. So now whenever I send it to this basic view, what I want to do is I want to reach out to my Diablo 2 context. Actually, what I want to do is I want to reach out to my repository, which already reaches out to my context. Let's get rid of this, actually. So if we go to my startup.cs HTML, my repository will reach out and get, whenever you try to get something using a repository pattern, so you can, if you only have one project in your application, you can get it from your context just fine. But since I already have the logic built in to get it from my repository, I'm going to go ahead and get it from my repository. So I need to tell it that I want an iDiablo2 repository, which will then inject in this Diablo2 repository object into my controller. So let's go back to my items controller, and I want a private iDiablo2 repository. I'm going to go ahead and call it repo. All right, using my interfaces project namespace. And then in my controller, I'm going to say, send me the repo via dependency injection, and then go ahead and set that in my constructor. So now when I go out to my repo, I will try to first get it from my web service, and if that web service I don't have running locally currently, it'll then just get it from my database. So it's just an abstraction layer between the different ways I can get my items. I'm going to go ahead and say repo.getAllItems, except I think the problem is I don't have a way to get all. I actually need a route in my repository to get all the item types and not the items. So let's actually go back. So I'm going to go to my interface. Diablo2 repository. Okay, so I need to do IEnumerable of item types, get all item types. Okay, so now that I have that inside of my interface, I need to come here and implement that, since in order to have an interface, you need to abide by the contract and implement all of the abstract methods. So I'll go ahead and control period that and implement my abstract method. And I'm going to essentially do the same thing I'm doing here. So I'm going to do that. I don't think I have this in the proxy, so I probably need to put this in my proxy here. IEnumerable of item type, get all item types. I believe that's what I called it. I'm going to go ahead and implement that here, and I'm just going to go ahead and throw a not implemented exception. So I'm just going to leave that the way it is and not deal with that, since I'm not currently having my, since I don't currently have it running. So get all item types. And now I need to fix this to return back those item types. So I'm going to return, if I catch an exception and I don't have my proxy running, I'm going to return my db context dot item types. I'm going to go ahead and say .toList. I'm going to put those as a list. I don't need the .include, but I'm going to need to .select those into a new type, since they're currently in different namespaces. So I'm going to have to say new item type. And I want to use the object initializer to initialize every single one of those types. All right, so let's see. The item type ID will be equal to the ID I have coming from the database, and the name, whoops, will be the name I have coming from the database. All right, so now I have get all item types. So I can get all items from my repository and get all item types from my repository. So let's go back to my controller again. Let's minimize some of these. Go back to my items controller. And now I can go to var items equals repo.getAllItemTypes. So I should probably have this called item types. Okay. And now I want to send those item types to the view. Well, first I want to set the view model. So you don't want to send your model to the view. Remember, you want to send your view model. So I'm going to say, let's go ahead and comment this out. I'm going to say var view model, which I did create, right? Okay, equals new item categories view model. And I might need to import the view model namespace using models.viewModels. And then I'm going to go ahead and use the object initializer and say the item types, yep. Item types equals inaccessible due to its protection level. What did I do? Did I not make it public? I don't need the proxy open, don't need the proxy open, don't need the repository open. No, I must not have. So public. All right. Let's go back to my items controller. All right, so that cleared up that error. I want to say that is equal to my repo.getAllItemTypes. And then it looks like it's currently an IEnumerable, so I might need to list that. Okay, and again, I'm getting a namespace clash. So you shouldn't run into these issues if you just have the single namespace. So don't worry too much about how I have to fix this. But I'm using the entities item type, and I'm returning the database item type. And I thought I told it to use the entities item type inside of my repository. So let's go back to the repository. And I'm returning entities here. Okay. Go back to my repository. Again, returning entities. So I must not be using entities inside of my view model. So let's go to my view model. Yeah, I'm using database.entities. I don't think I want to do that. Let's see if that fixes my controller. Okay, and it does. So a little bit of namespace clashing there, but it's fixed now. So I have my view model that I'm going to end up sending to my view, and then I'm going to set the item types equal to the item types that I have coming from my repository, which at the end of the day is reaching out to my database. And I'll send that to my Razor view. All right. So now, let's go to our Razor view. So go to Views, Items, Basic. So remember, the first thing we need to do, whenever we want to use a view model in our Razor view, we can say @model. items categories view model. And it's probably not going to see that now. What we'll need to do is go to our view imports and add that here. So I want to say using com.diablo2.models.viewModels. Go ahead and save that. Now it should see that here. Categories view model. Item category item. And there we go. Okay, so that red line went away. So now it sees the view model that we're using on our view. So I'm going to go ahead and put, the first thing I'm going to say is I'm going to put a heading. And I'm going to say Diablo 2 items, choose a type to display results. I'm going to go ahead and just try to throw that in the middle. It's never good to put inline CSS, but just to make it look good real fast. And then I want to display those items on my web page. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with my @ sign, and I'm going to say for each. And notice I can now put C# here, and I'm going to say for my in model dot item types. So my item types is a list of my item types. So now I can say, one thing I can do is I can give it a div, so I want to make a new division because I want them to show up on their own line. And then I can then make a tag helper that will then have an anchor to maybe another controller action. So ASP controller equals items, ASP action equals, let's say, type, and then ASP route ID. So maybe since our default action, we can give it an ID, we can say @item.id, @item dot ID. And now I have an anchor that I can now put @item.name. All right, so now that I have all of my items from my repository, let's go ahead and try to run it and see if that worked. Show basic Diablo 2 items, which should take us to /items controller /basic, which should then reach out to our repository, if you remember. /item /basic, it should reach out to our repository and return back a view model with all of our items in it. So let's see if it does that. And there we go. So Diablo 2 items, choose a type to display the results. We can see that I went out to my database from my repository, and now I have all of my items I can choose from that you can see at the bottom. If you hover over these, with those anchors, it goes to /items /types. It should go to my type action, which I currently do not have. And then it should pass a query string variable of item ID equals 10, 9, 8, 7, whatever the case is. So in order to go there, we'll need to make an action in our controller called type. So I'm going to say public action result type string item ID I'll just go ahead and default it to 0 right now. Um, okay, and then there we can just return view. So hopefully this video takes you through a little bit of an introduction on Razor views, showing us how we can display the information we're getting back from our database. We can loop over it. We can assign it to our view models and pass those view models to our views. We can also, one thing I'll mention is you can also get views specifically. So if you pass, say, basic, you can also explicitly get views by telling ASP.NET Core exactly which view to look for. That's one way to do that. Or you can simply use view with the view model, which will tell ASP.NET Core to infer the view that you want based on the action result. So that's how you can synchronously get information from your databases and redirect to other views and other actions. In the next video, I'm going to cover something that's not covered in the book, and that's how to asynchronously get information without having to change the page you're on. So since this video is getting a little lengthy, I'm going to go ahead and stop this one, and I'll see you guys in the next video.